Hello and welcome back to Team 5024's Steam at Home. Today we're going to be learning how to make a delicious loaf of bread and the science behind it. For this recipe you're going to need 6 cups of flour, 1 tablespoon of sugar, 1 tablespoon of salt, 2 cups of water, and 1 packet or around a tablespoon of dry active yeast. We're going to start by warming up the water for a little bit in the microwave. Use a thermometer to make sure it's around 40 degrees Celsius. Don't go more than a couple degrees over. I overshot a little bit, but that's okay. If you do the same, just move on to the next step while we wait for the water to cool. I'm going to measure out a tablespoon each of salt and sugar and set them aside. Yeast is a single-celled organism that's going to help us to make the bubbles in our bread later. It's actually a fungus, so it's related to mushrooms. Active dry yeast has had all of its moisture removed, so it stays dormant but alive. This allows the yeast to be stored for much longer periods of time than fresh yeast. Now that my water's cooled down a bit, I can dissolve the yeast in the lukewarm water. Dissolve the salt and sugar mixture as well. This combination of moisture, heat, and sugar is going to help the yeast rehydrate and be active again. In order to produce energy, yeast, like humans, undergoes a process called aerobic cellular respiration. The yeast can convert oxygen and sugars into carbon dioxide. Since a gas is a byproduct of this reaction, you may see that air bubbles begin to form. This is good as it means the reaction's working, and it's going to help to give our bread a light, fluffy, and delicious texture. Next, move your liquid mixture to a large mixing bowl. Measure out 6 cups of flour, 1 cup at a time, and stir in between each cup. As you do this, you'll notice that the mixture begins to resemble what a bread dough typically looks like. Keep adding flour and mixing with a fork for as long as possible. Eventually there's going to be a point where the dough becomes so thick that you're going to need to use your hands. For me, this came about between the 5th and 6th cup of flour. Simply cover your hands in a coat of flour to prevent sticking. Now you can use them to keep on mixing the dough. Once you've finished adding the flour, you've added all there is to add to the bread. Now all it's going to take is some work, patience, and of course chemistry. Again, make sure your hands are cleaned and then coated in flour before handling the dough. As you can see, our dough is now quite thick and a bit stretchy. It's time to move our dough onto a floured surface so you can begin to knead it. You can work in the last bits of flour as you need. What I found worked best was to stretch the dough away from me and into the table with my palm, and then to fold it back over itself. Rotate and do it again. Repeat this until the dough is well incorporated and feels springy to the touch. Kneading the dough is important, and it serves 2 major purposes. As you mix, 2 proteins that are naturally found in flour, called glutenin and gliadin, will begin to develop into gluten. This is important because gluten is very elasticy. This will make the dough stretchy and give the bread some chewiness. Additionally, as you continue to fold and knead the dough, you'll mix some tiny air bubbles into it. This will make sure that the yeast have all the oxygen they need to keep producing carbon dioxide. This will allow the dough to continue to rise. You'll need to knead for around 5 minutes before your dough is ready. Put your dough in a well-oiled bowl and flip it to make sure that both sides get greased. Cover it with a slightly damp cloth and let it rest for a couple of hours in a slightly warm place. This is going to give plenty of time for the yeast to continue doing its work and producing carbon dioxide, which is going to give the bread a perfect texture. After a couple hours, your dough should have about doubled in size. Now you can take it out of the bowl again and back onto your floured surface. Take a moment to pop some of the larger air bubbles. Give the bread a little punch and fold it over itself a couple times, to try to give it an even crumb. By the way, crumb is the word for the pattern of air bubbles that you'll see once you cut the finished product open. Next you'll want to cut your dough in half. We actually made enough for 2 loaves of bread. Now, it's time to shape your dough into loaves. To do this, you're going to want to pinch the dough from the edge of the loaf and pull it into the center. Try to hide any variations or creases. That way, the underside should be nice and uniform, so when you flip it, you'll get a nice smooth even surface on top. Next, you want to place your loaves on a baking stone lightly sprinkled with cornmeal. If you don't have cornmeal, it's okay to leave it out, and if you don't have a baking stone, a standard cookie sheet should do the trick just fine. Now comes the fun part. Using a sharp knife, cut shallow slices into the surface of the bread. This will give the dough room to rise. I'm doing my first one in a traditional style with 3 diagonal lines. Please always remember to be careful when dealing with sharp objects, and if you need, feel free to get a parent to help. With that said though, I do encourage you to be creative with your designs. I've decided to do my second loaf in the shape of a 5-pointed star. Again, remember to be careful. Always remember to cut away from yourself and keep your finger away from the blade of the knife. Other than that, let your imagination run wild. Once you're finished with that, cover your loaves to rest one more time while you preheat your oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. If you can, put an aluminum roasting pan with a bit of water in it on the bottom rack of your oven in order to keep the bread moist during cooking. Just before you put your loaves in the oven, you can sprinkle them with a bit of flour and brush on a little bit of water. The water will help the bread to cook evenly. Now it's time to put your loaves in the oven. Ovens get hot, so remember to always stay safe, and get an adult to help if necessary. After around 10 minutes at 500 degrees, lower the temperature to 400 and keep baking for around 10 to 15 more minutes. The bread should now be finished and ready to come out. Hot air expands, and since your dough is filled with bubbles, this is what allows the dough to rise. Once it's risen, the dough will solidify, which will prevent it from shrinking back down again once it cools. At the same time, the heat will also kill off the yeast and brown the outside to form a crust. Just let the bread cool on a cooling rack slightly before cutting into it, and that's it! Congratulations! You're now ready to enjoy your very own homemade bread. Catch us next time on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow us on our platforms.